The wind began to howl long before the sun disappeared behind the mountains. It came crawling down the rocky slopes like something alive, brushing through the tall pine trees and making them whisper secrets to one another. The cold followed close behind, slipping through cracks in wood and bone alike, settling deep into the valley where only the strongest men dared to live. Elias Carter stood still beside the frozen stream, his breath rising in slow white clouds. The sky above was turning that deep purple shade that came just before night swallowed everything whole. He had spent most of the day tracking elk prints across the ridge, his boots crunching through snow that hadn't yet melted from last week's storm. He should have gone back earlier. The mountains had a way of reminding men who truly belonged there. Elias turned, pulling his coat tighter as the wind picked up again. His cabin sat a mile down the slope, tucked between a cluster of pine trees that shielded it from the worst of the weather. He'd built it himself years ago, with rough hands and silent patience. Every log in its walls had been placed by him. Every nail hammered into the frame carried a story. He didn't talk much. Out here, there was no one to talk to anyway. But tonight, something felt different. He paused, his sharp eyes narrowing as he looked across the ridge. At first, he thought it was just a shadow. The fading light played tricks sometimes, stretching shapes across the snow until they looked like something else entirely. Then the shadow moved. Elias stiffened. A small figure stood halfway up the slope, barely visible through the drifting snow. Too small to be a grown man. Too still to be an animal. A child. His first instinct was to look around, searching for others. No one sent a child alone into the mountains. Not in weather like this. But the ridge was empty, silent except for the wind and the distant creak of trees bending under the cold. The child didn't move. Elias hesitated for only a second before starting toward them, his boots sinking deep into the snow. As he got closer, he could make out more details: a thin coat, worn boots, and a face pale from the cold. It was a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 8. Her dark hair clung to her cheeks, damp from melting snow. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, but she didn't cry. She didn't call out. She just stood there, as if she'd been waiting for him. "What are you doing out here?" Elias asked, his voice rough from disuse. She didn't answer. He stopped a few feet away, lowering himself slightly so he didn't seem so tall. Up close, he could see the way her hands trembled. Her lips were dry and cracked from the cold. "You alone?" he asked. The girl nodded slowly. That was when something twisted in his chest. No child should be alone in the mountains at night. "Where's your family?" he asked gently. She looked down at her boots. For a moment, the only sound between them was the wind. Then she spoke, her voice so quiet he almost didn't hear it. "My father," she said. Elias waited. She swallowed, her fingers gripping the sleeves of her coat. He does that every night." Elias frowned. "Does what?" The girl hesitated. Her shoulders shook once, not from crying, from remembering. "He leaves me outside." The words hit harder than the cold ever could. Elias felt something inside him go still. He looked at her again, really looked this time. The thin coat, the worn boots, the way she stood like she was used to the cold, like she had learned to endure it. "How long?" he asked quietly. She shrugged. "Since the snow started," she said. "He says I need to be strong." The wind howled again, louder this time, and Elias felt anger rise in his chest, sharp and sudden. The mountains were no place for lessons like that. A child could freeze to death in a single night out here. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lena." "Well, Lena," he said, his voice softer now, "you're coming with me." She looked up quickly, fear flashing across her face. "I can't," she said. "He'll be mad." Elias stared at her for a long moment. Then he did the unthinkable. He took off his thick coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The girl froze, her eyes wide. "No one's leaving you out here tonight," he said firmly. "Not while I'm around." She opened her mouth like she wanted to argue, but the warmth of the coat seemed to break something inside her. Her small hands clutched the fabric tightly, and for the first time, her eyes filled with tears. Elias didn't ask any more questions. Instead, he reached down and lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than she should have been. The snow had started to fall harder now, the path back to his cabin already fading beneath fresh powder. But Elias knew every inch of these mountains. He moved carefully, steady and sure, shielding Lena from the worst of the wind as he walked. She didn't speak, she just held on to him. By the time the cabin came into view, the sky had turned completely dark. The warm glow of the lantern in his window cut through the night like a promise. Inside, the fire still burned low in the stone hearth. Elias pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. The warmth hit them instantly, and Lena let out a small sound, half relief, half disbelief. He set her gently on the chair closest to the fire. "Stay there," he said. She nodded, her eyes locked on the flames. Elias moved quickly, adding more wood to the fire until it roared back to life. Then he poured a cup of hot water from the kettle and handed it to her. "Careful," he said, "it's warm." She wrapped her hands around the cup, staring at the steam rising from it like she'd never seen anything so wonderful before. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Elias leaned against the wall, watching her. He didn't know what kind of father would leave a child outside in the cold every night. He didn't know what kind of man thought that was strength. But he knew one thing. He wasn't sending her back out there. Lena took a small sip, then looked up at him. "Are you a mountain man?" she asked softly. Elias almost smiled. "Guess so," he said. She nodded, like that made sense. "My father says mountain men don't feel cold," she said. Elias looked at the fire. "We do," he said. "We just don't let it stop us." She seemed to think about that. Then, after a moment, she spoke again. "My father used to light a lantern every night," she said. Before the snow came, Elias glanced at her. "He said it kept the dark away," she continued. "He'd put it by the door so I could see it from my bed." Her voice was small now, distant. But then he stopped. Elias didn't interrupt. "He said I had to learn not to be afraid," she said. "So now he makes me stand outside in the dark." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Elias felt his jaw tighten. No child should be taught that way. No child should have to stand alone in the dark to prove they were strong. Lena wiped her nose with the back of her hand. "I tried not to cry," she said. "Every night." Elias pushed away from the wall. He walked over to the small table near the window and picked up the old lantern that sat there. It was scratched and worn, the glass slightly fogged with age. He lit it. The warm golden light filled the room instantly, soft and steady. Then he carried it to the door and set it down right beside it. Lena watched him, confused. Elias turned back to her. "My father did that every night too," he said quietly. Her eyes widened. "He did?" she asked. He nodded. "He said no matter how dark it got, I'd always be able to find my way home." Lena stared at the lantern for a long time. Then she whispered, "It makes it feel safe." Elias looked at her, really looked at her. And in that moment, something changed. He wasn't just a man living alone in the mountains anymore. He was someone's shelter. And for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel empty. The storm arrived sometime after midnight. Elias woke to the sound of wind slamming against the cabin walls, rattling the shutters so hard they knocked like someone trying to get inside. For a moment, he didn't move. He lay still under the thick wool blanket, listening to the storm roar across the mountains like a living thing. Snow scraped against the roof. The pine trees outside groaned under the weight of ice and wind. The lantern beside the door flickered, its glow dancing across the wooden floor. Then he remembered. Lena. He sat up immediately. The girl was curled up in the chair near the fire, wrapped in one of his old blankets. Sometime during the night, she must have drifted to sleep. Her small face was peaceful now, her breathing slow and steady. One of her hands still clutched the edge of his coat, as if she was afraid it might disappear if she let go. Elias stood quietly, careful not to wake her. The fire had burned low again, so he added more wood, crouching as the flames slowly came back to life. Warmth spread through the room, pushing the cold back toward the door where it belonged. Outside, the storm grew louder. The kind of storm that buried trails and erased tracks. The kind that swallowed sounds and made men disappear. Elias walked to the window and brushed the frost away with his sleeve. Snow was falling thick and fast, covering everything in sight. The path down the ridge was already gone. If someone was looking for Lena, they wouldn't find her now. He didn't know if that was a good thing or not. Behind him, he heard a soft movement. He turned to see Lena shifting under the blanket, her eyes slowly opening. For a moment, she looked confused, like she couldn't remember where she was. Then she saw the fire, the lantern by the door, and finally Elias standing by the window. She sat up quickly. "I fell asleep," she said, her voice thick with sleep. Elias nodded. "You needed it." She looked toward the door. The storm howled loudly, and her shoulders tensed. "Is it bad?" she asked. "Real bad," Elias said. "Storm like this can last a couple days." Her fingers tightened on the blanket. "My father won't like that," she whispered. Elias turned fully toward her. "You think he'll come looking?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at the floor, her small toes peeking out from under the blanket. "He doesn't come when it storms," she said quietly. "He says the mountain decides who's strong." Elias felt anger flicker again, hot and sudden. "That's so," he muttered. She nodded. "He says if I can stand outside all night, I won't be afraid anymore." Elias walked over and crouched in front of her so they were at the same level. "And does it make you less afraid?" he asked gently. Lena looked at him, her eyes honest and tired. "No," she said. The words sat heavy between them. Elias stood and walked to the small shelf near the stove. He pulled down a tin plate and a small loaf of bread. From a pot hanging near the fire, he poured some leftover stew into a bowl and set it near the flames to warm. Lena watched every movement, quiet and still. "When's the last time you ate?" he asked. She shrugged. "Yesterday morning," she said. "I think." Elias paused for a moment, then continued stirring the stew. When it was warm, he handed her the bowl. She took it carefully, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to. The steam rose up, carrying the smell of meat and herbs. For a second, she just stared at it. "Go on," Elias said. "It won't bite." She took a small bite. Then another. Within seconds, she was eating quickly, like someone afraid the food might disappear if she didn't hurry. Elias looked away, giving her the dignity of pretending not to notice. Outside, the storm pounded against the cabin. Inside, the only sound was the crackling fire and the soft scrape of Lena's spoon against the bowl. After a while, she slowed down. "Thank you," she said quietly. Elias nodded once. "You can have more if you're still hungry." She shook her head. "I'm full." He didn't believe that, but he didn't push. Instead, he moved to the door and opened it just a crack. Wind burst inside immediately, sharp and freezing. Snow swirled in through the opening before he shut it again. The world outside had disappeared. White, endless, unforgiving. He turned back toward the room and saw Lena watching him. "Are you going somewhere?" she asked. "Just checking the storm," he said. She seemed relieved. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "My father used to sit by the fire too," she said suddenly. Elias leaned against the wall. "Used to?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Before Mama died." The room grew quiet. Elias didn't speak. After she died, he stopped talking. Lena continued. Stopped smiling too. Her eyes were fixed on the flames now. "He said the world was hard," she whispered. "And I had to be harder." Elias looked at the lantern by the door, its soft light still burning. "How long ago did she die?" he asked. "Last winter." He nodded slowly. Grief did strange things to people. Twisted them. Broke them in places no one could see. But this wasn't grief. This was something else. Lena rubbed her hands together, warming them by the fire. "Do you live here all alone?" she asked. "Yeah, aren't you scared?" Elias thought about that. "Sometimes," he admitted. Her eyes widened slightly. "But I got used to it," he added. "Mountains teach you how to be alone without being lonely." She seemed to think about that for a long time. "I don't like being alone," she said. "I know," Elias replied quietly. The storm raged harder. Hours passed. They sat in silence, the fire burning strong, the wind screaming outside like it was trying to tear the cabin apart. At some point, Lena curled up on the floor closer to the hearth, her head resting on the folded blanket. Elias covered her with another one. He stayed awake, listening, watching, waiting. Then, sometime near morning, he heard something. A faint sound. Knocking. He froze. At first, he thought it was just the storm. Branches hitting the walls, ice cracking under the wind. But then it came again. 3 slow, Heavy knocks. Lena stirred. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Elias didn't answer. He reached for the rifle leaning against the wall. Another knock. Louder this time. He walked to the door slowly, each step careful and quiet. The lantern light flickered across the wood as he stood there, his hand resting on the handle. Lena sat up behind him. "Is it him?" she asked, her voice small. Elias didn't know, but something in his chest told him it was. He opened the door just enough to see. A man stood there, covered in snow from head to toe. His beard was thick with ice. His shoulders hunched against the wind. His eyes were wild and tired. He looked past Elias, straight into the cabin. Straight at Lena. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the man's voice came out rough and broken. "Lena." The girl froze. Elias felt her small hand grab the back of his coat. "Papa," she whispered. The man stepped forward, but Elias didn't move aside. "Where did you take her?" the man demanded, his voice shaking with cold and anger. Elias stood firm. "I found her alone on the ridge," he said. "In the dark." The man's face tightened. "I was teaching her," he snapped. "Teaching her what?" Elias asked, his voice low. "How to freeze." The wind howled between them. Snow blew into the doorway, covering the floor in a thin white layer. The man looked at Lena again. She didn't move, didn't run to him, didn't smile. She just held onto Elias's coat. And for the first time, something like doubt flickered across the man's face.